compassion, health care, and institutional charity. In the Roman Empire and other ancient societies, care for the sick and poor was sporadic and limited. There were no hospitals as we know them, no public welfare for the destitute. Charity was considered a personal virtue at best, not a civic or universal duty. Here, Christianity introduced and institutionalized a radically new ethos, organized compassion, viewing the care of the suffering as a sacred responsibility. From its inception, the Christian movement took seriously Jesus' teaching that his followers must care for the least of these. The New Testament records how the first Christians pooled resources to support widows and the impoverished among them. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the church in each city had a structured ministry of relief. Deacons were appointed to distribute food daily to those in need. The wealthier members often gave generously beyond their tithes to ransom captives or feed the hungry in times of famine. This was utterly distinctive. The pagan polytheistic religions had no comparable practice. Roman priests performed rituals but did not run almshouses. The idea of a community where, if one member suffers, all suffer together, as Paul wrote, was revolutionary. One of the earliest outsiders to comment on Christian charity was the pagan satirist Lucian in the 2nd century, who sneered that the Galileans support not only their own poor, but even strangers. He found it curious that, due to Christian kindness, they have prospered in these practices. It wasn't meant as praise, but it highlighted a fact. Christians cared for others, even those outside their faith, in ways no one else did. This became especially evident during calamities. In AD 249-262, a terrible plague, likely smallpox, swept the Roman Empire. Contemporary accounts tell how people fled the cities or even cast out their infected relatives to avoid contagion. But in those same cities, the Christians, instead of fleeing, tended the sick and dying. Bishop Dionysius of Alexandria wrote that during the plague, Christians showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, comforting them and often dying in their place. Their actions saved numerous lives simply by providing basic care, food, water, cleaning, to people who would otherwise have perished untended. These acts of mercy left a deep impression on observers and are credited by some historians, like Rodney Stark, with contributing to the growth of the church. People saw that Christians, in stark contrast to others, would love even strangers at great cost. Christian compassion did not remain informal. Once the church had freedom and resources after Constantine, believers quickly established enduring charitable institutions. Most notable was the creation of the first hospitals. In 369 AD, Saint Basil of Caesarea, a Greek church father, founded what was effectively the world's first public hospital in Cappadocia, Asia Minor. It was a large complex that included housing for the poor, a ward for the sick, and even a section dedicated to caring for lepers, who were the most reviled and isolated outcasts of that era. Basil's hospital, often called the Basiliad, provided care to anyone in need, regardless of background, for free. Basil staffed it with trained physicians, many of them clergy or monks, and nurses who saw their work as Christian service. This model spread rapidly. By the end of the 4th century, there were hospitals in Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and elsewhere, almost all founded by devout bishops or wealthy Christian philanthropists. In the Latin West, one early hospital was built by Fabiola, a Roman Christian noblewoman, who used her fortune to open a clinic in Rome for the sick poor and personally tended their wounds. These were unprecedented developments. Prior to Christianity, one could find healing temples, like those of Asclepius in Greece, where ailing people might pray or sleep in hopes of a cure, and the Romans had military hospitals for soldiers. But a hospital open to the public, supported by donations, and run out of religious duty to care for any sufferer, that was new. The very word hospitality took on a new meaning in Christian parlance, Xenodochia were guest houses attached to monasteries that evolved to treat illness as well. Over time, hospitals became a fixture of Christian civilization. By medieval times, every major city in Europe had a hospital or infirmary, often connected to a monastery or cathedral chapter. Religious orders specialized in care. For example, the Order of the Holy Spirit, founded 12th century, ran hospitals throughout Europe, and the Knights Hospitaller, founded during the Crusades, established hospitals for pilgrims in the Holy Land and later across Europe. Christian compassion extended beyond physical health to all manners of suffering. The Church set up the first orphanages, for example. In ancient Rome, unwanted babies were often left in the streets. Christians took them in. By the 4th century, churches had organized efforts to raise or find homes for these foundlings. Similarly, care for the elderly who had no family became a Christian distinctive. Rather than abandoning them, Christians provided communal support. During the Middle Ages, monasteries served as both spiritual centers and social service centers. Monks dispensed alms daily at their gates, ran shelters for travelers, the word hotel shares the same root as hospital, and maintained infirmaries where monks, and sometimes members of the public, could recover from illness. Convents of nuns often focused on nursing. For instance, orders like the Beguines in the Low Countries, lay religious women, were renowned for caring for the sick and dying in towns. Moving into the modern era, the Christian impetus for organized charity only grew. The 19th century in particular saw an explosion of charitable organizations, virtually all founded on Christian inspiration. This was the era that gave birth to groups like the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, Catholic laypeople helping the poor, the Salvation Army, Protestant soldiers fighting against poverty and vice on the streets of England, and the YMCA, providing guidance and housing for young working men. Florence Nightingale, the founder of modern nursing, was driven by a profound Christian calling to serve the sick. Her establishment of nursing schools and elevation of nursing as a respectable, compassion-driven profession was steeped in her faith. She often referred to her work in hospitals as fulfilling God's call to nurse Christ in the least of these. In international humanitarianism, Christian influence has been foundational as well. Henry Dunant, a Swiss Reformed Christian, was so horrified by the suffering of wounded soldiers at the Battle of Solferino, 1859, that he mobilized volunteers to care for them regardless of which side they fought on. This led to the formation of the International Red Cross and the First Geneva Convention, essentially the beginnings of modern wartime humanitarian law, all sparked by Dunant's Christian conscience. The Red Cross symbol, inversely the Swiss flag, intentionally echoes Christian imagery of mercy. At the community level, countless local hospitals throughout the world began as Christian missions. In Asia, Africa, and the Americas, missionary doctors and nurses built clinics and hospitals, many of which are today among the leading medical centers in those regions. For example, Christian Medical College in Vellore, India, or Severance Hospital in Korea, founded by a missionary doctor. To this day, a significant percentage of healthcare in many developing countries is delivered by church-run institutions. In sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, it's estimated that 30% to 70% of health services are provided by faith-based organizations, most of them Christian. These include large networks of hospitals, hospices. The modern hospice movement for end-of-life care was pioneered by Dame Cicely Saunders, a devout Christian in 20th century Britain, and clinics serving remote areas. It's not an exaggeration to say that the very concept of humanitarian aid, organized efforts to relieve suffering in crisis or chronic need, is a largely Christian invention. This concept has, of course, been embraced by secular institutions and those of other faiths in the modern world, but historically it was the Christian Church that set the example. Emperor Julian's attempt to spur pagan charity in the 360s, essentially to copy the Christian model, fizzled once his reign ended, whereas the Church's model endured and grew. The Christian contribution in this domain can be summarized simply: it made compassion effective. It turned loving sentiment into lasting structure. Hospitals, orphanages, soup kitchens, shelters, these all sprang from practical Christianity. Secular society eventually adopted many of these as public services, but the church was the trailblazer. Moreover, Christian morality placed high value on caring for those who could never repay. This selfless love, what the Greeks called agape and Latin caritas, giving us the word charity, became a cornerstone of Western ethics. Today, when we take for granted that the sick should be treated and the poor assisted, we are living in the cultural house that Christianity built. Law, justice, and human rights. Perhaps one of the most profound yet sometimes overlooked areas of Christian impact is on our concepts of law, justice, and human rights. We have already touched on how Christian values influenced Roman law under Christian emperors, protecting children and slaves, mitigating punishments, etc. But even more fundamentally, Christian theology altered how people conceive of justice. It introduced the idea that even the highest earthly authority is under divine authority, the premise of rule of law. It also furnished the moral ingredients, human equality and moral responsibility, that later flowered into the doctrine of universal human rights. Consider the long road from the Roman Empire's legal code to modern international human rights declarations. Along that road, key milestones bear a Christian imprint. In medieval Europe, the Church's canon law developed robust principles of justice. The notion of natural law, that there are God-given rights and wrongs knowable to reason, was articulated clearly by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Aquinas argued that laws contradicting God's moral law were unjust and should be reformed or even disobeyed, a line of thought that runs straight to Martin Luther King Jr., quoting St. Augustine, "An unjust law is no law at all," during the Civil Rights Movement. The Magna Carta of 1215, often hailed as a proto-constitution, had significant church involvement. It was drafted with the help of Stephen Langton, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Magna Carta established that even the king must obey certain laws and respect certain rights, like due process. It specifically protected the freedom of the church and gave rights to barons and some commoners, planting seeds for later democratic developments. Why did the rebellious barons demand such a charter? In part, because the church had long taught that kings who violate God's law, for example, by infringing the church's liberties or abusing their subjects, are in the wrong. The medieval church, for all its flaws, acted at times as a check on temporal power, excommunicating tyrannical rulers, mediating disputes through moral authority, etc. Christian jurists also influenced emerging ideas of rights in the early modern period. The Spanish Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas in the 16th century forcefully argued for the rights of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, insisting they were fully human and entitled to liberty and justice, directly opposing the notion that Spanish conquest could strip them of those rights. His persistent advocacy, grounded in Christian teaching, led to Spain passing the new laws of 1542, which were intended to prevent the enslavement and abuse of Native Americans, though enforcement lagged. In the Enlightenment era, the language of natural rights became more secular in tone, yet it drew heavily on centuries of Christian thought. John Locke, whose writings on life, liberty, and property shaped liberal democracies, explicitly anchored human equality in our creation by God. We are all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise Maker, Locke wrote, hence none of us is naturally subordinate to another. Thomas Jefferson's famous line, "All men are created equal," in the American Declaration of Independence, echoes that Lockean and ultimately biblical idea. The concept of creatio, creation, lies behind creatio, equal creation, which lies behind inherent rights. Christian activists were at the forefront of pushing these ideals into reality. The movement to abolish the slave trade and slavery was spearheaded by devout Christians. In Britain, William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect, evangelical Anglicans, campaigned tirelessly until the slave trade was abolished in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833. They constantly appealed to Christian conscience, flooding Parliament with evidence of the trade's cruelties and reminding the nation that all humans are brothers under God. In the United States, the abolitionist movement was energized by the Second Great Awakening. Preachers like Charles Finney declared slavery a great national sin, and escaped slaves like Frederick Douglass invoked the Christianity of the Declaration of Independence to shame America into ending bondage. It is poignant that the African American spiritual "Go Down, Moses" became an anthem of liberation, identifying with the Hebrew slaves freed by God's mighty hand. When at last slavery was ended, it was seen by many, including President Lincoln, as a sort of divine judgment and mercy, a step toward aligning the nation's laws with God's higher law that he has made of one blood all nations of men. Acts 17:26. In the 19th century, Christians also led movements to reform prisons, end child labor, and protect workers. Lord Shaftesbury, a devout evangelical in England, championed laws to limit working hours and forbid the exploitation of children in mines and factories. His Christian compassion for the downtrodden helped launch what we now call the labor rights movement. The Christian commitment to the dignity of life also shaped penal reform. Earlier, I mentioned how Constantine's conversion instigated more humane punishment practices. Jumping forward, one finds people like Elizabeth Fry, a Quaker, in the early 1800s, campaigning to improve the horrid conditions in women's prisons, providing basic necessities and advocating rehabilitation instead of mere retribution. This introduced the idea that even criminals should be treated humanely because they, too, are made in God's image and capable of redemption. The ultimate embodiment of Christian principles in law came with the advent of formal declarations of human rights in the mid-20th century. After the atrocities of World War II, the world gathered to articulate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Several of its drafters were strongly influenced by Christian ethics. Charles Malik of Lebanon was an Orthodox Christian philosopher who drew on Thomistic natural law. P.C. Chang of China, while culturally Confucian, acknowledged the deep resonance between Christian ideas and universal ethics. And the Frenchman Jacques Maritain, a leading Catholic intellectual, though not a delegate, was instrumental in shaping the philosophical consensus behind the scenes. The result was a document that, while secular in tone, proclaimed ideals very much in harmony with Christian teaching: the equal and inherent dignity of all members of the human family, the right to life, to liberty of conscience, to justice under law, and so forth. On the ground, Christian leaders have continued to spur social justice. The civil rights movement in the United States was led by clergymen like Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, and many others, operating largely out of black churches. They borrowed the rhetoric of the Hebrew prophets and the liberating God of Exodus. King preached from Amos and Isaiah, envisioning justice rolling down like waters. He led peaceful protests informed by Jesus' ethic of nonviolence and sacrificial love. The fact that the civil rights movement found its strength in the churches is a testimony to the black community's abiding Christian faith. It propelled America to finally rectify laws that had long oppressed African Americans, culminating in the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, legal milestones toward the biblical principle that God made from one blood every nation of men. Similarly, in South Africa, the struggle against apartheid gained momentum through Christian voices. Archbishop Desmond Tutu and many church leaders called for reconciliation and justice grounded in the Christian belief that all races are equally God's children. When apartheid fell, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Tutu, exemplified a Christian approach to transitional justice, emphasizing confession, forgiveness, and restoration rather than vengeance. From antiquity to today, Christianity has persistently injected into law the moral leaven that human life is sacred and moral truth is binding. It has served as both prod and guide for societal conscience. Our modern vocabulary of rights, to speak, to worship freely, to be treated equally, though often expressed in secular terms, has unmistakable Christian roots.